What do people find at your website, powderburns.org?
They find a lot of stories that are written, especially now on the people. See, a lot of people say, well, what does it got to do with us now, 15 years or 20 years later? The problem that we're having is that the same people that were in the White House at that time period are still there. I'm talking about Negroponte, who was the ambassador in Guatemala, in Honduras, who built the Death Squad Battalion 316. Now he is the Deputy Secretary of State.
And he helped build Death Squad?
Yes, sir.
In which country?
In Honduras.
In Honduras?
Yes, Honduras in Central America.
Now, Honduras, what would be going on in Honduras that they would have Death Squad?
Well, training, the Civil War down in Guatemala, number one, and the Civil War that was going on in El Salvador.
Now, the Civil War in Guatemala has gone on for about 30 years, and about 200,000 people in a very small country have died in that time. It's staggering.
Absolutely.
And the U.S. government is implicated.
Well, we implicated because we actually trained the Death Squads. You know, we used.
They deny that. You know, they say
but they now have admitted it because we had the School of the Americas where we've been trying to protest.
That to avoid the bad publicity,
but they do train, and I work with the Death Squads. I work as part of the liaison with.
Did you ever see them kill anyone?
Yes, sir. I certainly did.
Really?
And documented it and took pictures before and after. So, Mark, if you ever feel
which they killed,
well, it's drug traffickers. What happened was Guatemala is the worst human rights violators in the Western Hemisphere, and basically they control all aspects of what happens in Guatemala. So if you have Colombians going in there trying to run loads of cocaine, of course they arrest them, they take the money, and then they kill them. And to set an example that nobody goes to Guatemala without their approval. Now,
without their approval?
So who's in charge of the Guatemalan military? The CIA. You know, we own those countries. I remember Randy Capser, and a CIA agent, once told me, he says, look, you know, I don't know what you're doing writing letters to Washington about what we're doing down here. He says we own these countries. We elect the president of this country. And if they don't play with us, we take them out, just like we did Noriega. You know, he worked for us for many years, and when we
that was 1988, wasn't it?
Yes, sir, 1988.
And you would be familiar with that while it was...
Yes, sir. I was down in Central America at that time period.
So Noriega was CIA...
Was CIA operative working for George Bush.
This is the president of Panama up till 1988 when George Bush Sr. ordered an invasion of Panama. 6,000 people were killed. People
exactly. Well, there's more than that, you know, to be honest with you, because there's no count, no official count.
And this just to dislodge one guy.
Yeah, one guy, just to get him out. And the reason they took him out was because, you know, he'd been an asset for the CIA for many, many years. But what happened was when they asked him to train the Contras in the Civil War in Nicaragua, in Panama, he refused. And basically he was double dealing. He was working for the cartels, and he was working for the U.S. Embassy. But and the reason he was able to do that is because we tied the cartels to the CIA. And there's, of course, a lot of documentation where we now see it that my allegations were true.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Yes. So Manuel Noriega's in prison now, serving a 40-year sentence for drug trafficking.
He's the only one that we consider him to be a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. So he should be out in the next couple of years, but they're going to try to extradite him to France because they do have warrants for his arrest for money laundering up there.
Money laundering. So, yeah, so what else have you observed? Assassination attempts?
Yes, we trained a lot of, for example, the guy that worked with me in El Salvador, Dr. Hector Regalado. He was Major Davison, and if most of you might know, Major Davison was head of the Death Squads, known as the godfather of the Death Squads in Central America.
What's his first name? Davidson?
Yeah, David Davison. He's got a French name, but
so he's a French name.
Yes, he's the one that had our assassinated Archbishop Romero in El Salvador.
What year would that be?
That was 1983 or 82, I think, if I'm mistaken. But that, they just continue to assassinate people. And then at one time period, they actually sent a hit squad to the United States to hit a lot of the Salvadorian military guys that were actually speaking out against the government of Salvador. And they actually came out to, for example, Los Angeles and killed some people that were talking about the atrocities down in Central America.
So this is during the Reagan period.
During the Reagan-Bush period, yes, sir.
Freedom fighter Ronald Reagan. Now, in that period when you're down in Latin America, the U.S. government is directing a lot of activities in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. What's the purpose of all this? Why is the CIA doing that, and why would DEA cooperate, and what do they get out of all that?
Well, basically what it is you got to fund a covert operation.
So no, they need some money that's given to them by Congress.
Exactly. And when Oliver North came into the picture, what he did was he sold, with the approval of the government, which was very illegal, sold the missiles to Iran. And he charged them 3 times the amount of the
because
price.
There was an embargo.
Yeah, so he took that money and he was supposed to give it to the Contras to fight the Nicaraguan resistance group down in Nicaragua. Instead, it went to Swiss bank accounts. For his wife and him and other members of what was known as the enterprise. So it was a funnel operation and from the U.S. government to Swiss bank accounts to use for covert operations everywhere in the world.
Now, if I could explain to you, what happens in the 1980s is that lots of cocaine is brought up and actually delivered to the United States in the black inner cities because crack cocaine makes a big appearance throughout the 1980s. And that's all related to the DEA and CIA funding their covert operations with this illegal slush cash. So,
exactly.
So the DEA and CIA became drug traffickers on a huge scale.
You know, you got to remember that the blacks didn't have transportation. You know, you got to, when Blandon, the CIA asset, they brought in large shipments. I saw the shipments of cocaine. They came to Ilopango Airport, and there were lots.
Where?
That's in El Salvador. Yeah. And they came in and they took the shipments to the U.S. to military bases, and on the return trips they brought arms for the Contras.
And you observed that?
I observed it. I reported it from the get-go, from the very beginning, because I am the one that covered El Salvador. And as a matter of fact, on January 16, 1986, I met with then Vice President George Bush. And he came up to me and asked me what my job description was in Central America, and I told him. And I also told him...
What did you tell him exactly?
He came up to me and said, well, I do international investigations on drug trafficking. He says, but I'm also the only agent that covers El Salvador. And we have intelligence that the Contras are heavily involved in drug trafficking. Well, he shook my hand, took a picture and walked away. So, I knew then and there that my government was complicit in the drug trade.
Yeah, and George Bush was head of CIA in the 70s.
Yes, early 70s. So it was very well instrumental, and they had everything planned out, and it worked until Gene Josephus got shot over Nicaragua and spilled the beans that his sources were, George Bush.
When was this?
This was in 86.
And what happened to that fellow?
Well, he retired in Oregon. He won't speak to anybody. He won't do any interviews or anything like that. So I guess he was pretty well paid off. And of course, Oliver North now has his own Fox News.
Yes, he's got a talk show after losing his run for the Senate.